Now, please welcome to the stage the Executive Director of Groundwork Action, Igor Volsky. Igor will moderate today's conversation with our esteemed panelists, Roshni Nedungadi, Alexandra Rojas, Cristina Tzintzún Ramirez, and Melissa Morales.
One more round of applause to the Congresswoman. A really inspiring speech and a great way to start off the panel. This is a panel about young people really shaping our economic conversation. And so I used a very young picture of myself up on the screen to try and fit in. But as we get into dialogue here about how one of the most diverse generations in history is leading the way in helping us think of a more inclusive economy, an economy that works for us all. Cristina, I want to start with you to really ground us in some history here. And Lindsay referenced what some of younger Americans have experienced, how neoliberal policies really haven't worked for them. Give us some more detail about why young people have embraced really a different, more progressive vision of our economy.
Yeah, first off, I think we're living through a political revolution that's happening not just in the United States, but across Western Europe with young people. So this is the most progressive generation in American history, the most civically engaged generation in American history that deeply believes in economic populism and not just making changes around the margins, but a disruption of the status quo and how we've thought about the economy and who it benefits. So it's also happening, I'm an older millennial, Igor, I don't know what generation you fall in, but I am old enough and spent 10 years leading a worker center organizing immigrant workers, right? We remember the 2008 financial crisis, right? And so a total collapse of the financial sector and people making demands on the system in a reimagination of what's possible. And we also young people have lived through COVID, where we had more young people living at home than since the Great Depression when we started measuring housing in this country, which also I think was a precursor to the conversations that we constantly see happening now about the housing crisis, was really a conversation about the economy. And so I do also want to say, while this is the first generation, you look at the fact that this generation faces multiple crises, a climate crisis that will, over the next 30 years, if left uncontested, displace 1.2 billion people around the globe, that a crisis of grotesque income inequality where the top 1% now has 15 times more wealth than the entire working and middle class of this country, and a democracy in decline. And as we've seen, as young people have surged to the polls to exercise their power, now at a national level, Republicans are saying we need to make it harder for young people to vote, and in rapidly demographically changing states like Arizona, Georgia, my home state of Texas, bill after bill and legislation to make it harder to vote. So young people, I just want to say, while they're up against a lot, I think we have to remember how far we have come, because we are, for the first time in the centered, since I remember, we have now centered talking about taxing the rich their fair share in the Democratic Party. It is no longer wild to talk about labor unions and the power of labor to build a strong economy, talking about the public good and investment in our greatest asset, the American people, and to regulate and rein in the power of corporate power and greed. We have come a long way. So yes, we still have a lot to do, but I also just want us to remember that the Democratic Party of the 90s is not the Democratic Party of today because of people like Congresswoman Ramirez.
Well, and let's talk about taxing the rich and how young people feel about taxing the rich. Roshni, Hit Strategies and Groundwork Action are releasing a new poll of how young people view the economy. And what we know, and I'll just give some top highlights here, 2/3 of young people are telling us that big corporations pay less than their fair share. 81% say that ensuring that they pay their fair share should be a high priority for the government. And also, majorities of millennials, 74%, 63% of Gen Zers tell us that the government should prioritize lifting people out of poverty. So it's a real inclusive view of our economy. Give us some more details. Let's dive into those numbers.
Yeah, so I think, like Cristina was saying, it's really important to understand that the younger generations are thinking about the economy in a very different way from previous generations. And I think often people mistake the idea that in a simple issues battery on a poll, just because jobs in the economy is not a priority issue for young people, that it's something that they don't care about. And that's just not the case. Currently, the top issue for young people is cost of living and inflation, because it's something that they're living with every day. But we typically see climate change rise to the top, healthcare rise to the top, racism and discrimination rise to the top. But really the way that young people are thinking about these issues is through an economic justice lens. So they're thinking about climate change through an economic justice lens. They're thinking about racism and discrimination through an economic justice lens. How do we use the economy to better incomes for communities of color and low-income communities? And so when we don't talk to young people about how important the economy is to them and how important their role is in the economy, we're really losing the opportunity to create this kind of new economic coalition and messaging with young people and bring them along with us and change the way that we're talking about the economy today. I think also very different from previous generations, young people truly believe that the government has a big role to play in changing the economy for the better. So they don't want it to be an individual's or a community's problem to fix what's going on with the economy. Despite the fact that they don't trust government institutions, they truly believe that the government has a big role to play in fixing the economy for young people and for communities of color and for low-income communities. And so it's a different way that we're used to talking about government's involvement in the economy when we're thinking about how we're approaching this idea with young people. Like you said, we asked how high a priority it should be for federal government to invest in low-income people and communities of color. And 68% of millennials and 63% of Gen Z say it's a big priority for them, compared to only 57% of the general population that thinks it's a priority. So this is a much higher priority for younger generations, and it's something that we should pay a little bit more attention to as we're talking to young folks about their priorities and thinking about how to engage them in discussions around voting and the economy.
Well, the young people... Can you hear me? Can you hear me?
Igor was just testing it for
I
everyone
was.
falling asleep. Yeah,
I was. So young people are prioritizing progressive values, but they're also acting on them. Melissa, talk a little bit about how young people are really leading with those values, and frankly, what we all, as progressives in this room, can do to help them.
Yes, it's definitely something we are seeing throughout our work across the country, and I think just want to underscore something that Roshni and Cristina both said, which is that there's a reason for this. There's a reason that young people are prioritizing more progressive, fair, more inclusive values, and it's because one's relationship to an experience with the economy that you have growing up heavily impacts what your worldview of the economy looks like as an adult. And so especially for a lot of people of color, people who have grown up with unfair economic policies, that is the lens that we're bringing in. And I think certainly major things like the housing crisis and the pandemic and how that's affected the economy, but also just identity and culture and the economy are tied up The economy is tied up in so many issues that we're thinking about that have affected people throughout their entire lives. So healthcare, housing, climate, immigration, all of these have economic ties and affect how young people especially are viewing the economy and the lens that they're viewing it through. So I think, part of the, to Roshni's point that we need to be talking to young people about this, like what is the lens that we're bringing to the work? And I think part of the debate that has frustrated me so far is that we are allowing the other side to really frame the messaging and the narrative around that debate. So we are having this debate about whether fairer, more inclusive policies are bad for the economy or bad for economic growth, when the truth is that a fairer, more inclusive economy is good for the economy. Because as the Congresswoman was saying, the economy is not about what's happening on Wall Street. The economy is people. And so, I'd really encourage us to reframe the way that we're talking about these things as, when we're thinking about things like the infrastructure law that's passing, like direct services programs that we talk about getting slashed when we're talking about, budgets and deficits. Those are not costs to people. Those are investments in people. And so when you're investing in those types of things, you're investing in a good economy. And that's the way that we should be framing this debate. There's two ways to cut the budget deficit. Sure, one would be to slash direct services, our investments in people, or one would be a fair tax policy where the uber wealthy actually pay their fair share. So, I think, yes, we need that. And so I just would as we're talking to young people and talking about these, and talking about young people and the policies that they're pushing that are about a more fair and inclusive economy, would encourage us to talk about them as investments in the tools and opportunities that we need to build a good life, and not as a cost to the American people.
No, that's an excellent point. I want to dig into this question of framing, but Alexandra, let me go to you, because Melissa also mentioned that it's a question of how leaders hear what young people are saying, and also how leaders respond. And so you've had some experience in helping mold some young leaders. And so I want to hear more from you about how should young leaders, elected leaders, be thinking about this new diverse generation and their vision for the economy?
Yeah, thank you so much, Igor, and the entire Econ team. I think it's important that young people, we know that we have the tools to change our realities. It's a matter of political will, whether or not we do that. And so I think for our leaders to understand that young people have already stepped up in huge ways and should be committed to building real political power for them to impact and actualize change. And as you mentioned, they've already been really, really critical of our institutions. There's been an erosion of trust because of the decades and decades of existential crises that have culminated into what we're facing now. And most recently, with this debt ceiling fight, young people, in addition to poor and working families, although we got something done, was sold out in a lot of ways. And so progressives in Congress, like Delia, she talked about her Novo, are fighting against austerity in a real concrete way. And those are the types of actions that young people are hungry to be able to see, is this new generation of leadership that not only understands them, but empowers them, that is committing to building real power with them in all aspects of government. Because we're inheriting the future that is being unfortunately set on fire by so many in our lobbying operation. And the last thing I'll say is that I think that young people want to see people fighting for everybody, not just young people. Young people understand that all of our, and as we've all been mentioning, all of our fates are tied together, and this is a multi-generational, multiracial movement for change that if we invest in ourselves, which is our young people, our next generation, we're going to feel the effects over time.
I want to dig into this question of framing. We obviously just had a huge conversation about the debt ceiling, and even though you have young people telling us that they want to make sure that the rich pay their fair share of taxes, even though they want to see greater investments in social programs. Maybe I'm too close to the speakers here. The conversation that we had in the media was actually very narrow, right? We talked about, as the Congresswoman mentioned, cutting benefits for the vulnerable populations, even though, again, it's so at odds with what most young people want, most voters want. So this is really a question for all of you. How can we close that gap of ensuring that the economic conversations that we have actually reflect what young people are asking for, what Americans are asking for? How do we fix that framing problem?
Well, I was just going to say, I work at NextGen. We run the country's largest youth vote operations across the country. And this past election, we were fighting with some of the folks that were trying to guide us on messaging. Like, the research was showing that, yes, abortion was a top issue, but that there was a huge cohort of young people that wanted to talk about the economy. And they said, don't talk about the economy, because when you ask people whether they trust Republicans or Democrats more, they trust Republicans, so just don't talk about it. And the reality is that if we're not talking about the economy, guess who's framing how the economy works and who it works for? And I think the big way we win on the economy is framing how the economy works and who it should work for, right? The idea that we should not just judge our economy by how well Wall Street is doing in the GDP, but we should judge our economy by how well ordinary people are doing. And that if you believe in a minimum wage that is a just living wage, which the majority of Americans do, guess what? There's only one party that actually believes in that, and not totally concretely, but overall, there's only one party that does. And guess what? If you believe in taxing the rich their fair share, which the vast majority of the American people do believe in, there's only one party that does. And if you believe in a strong labor movement, which the vast majority of Americans do, then there's only one party that does. And if we haven't made progress, it's because Republicans that answer to an ultra-wealthy elite and big corporations are blocking interest in progress. So, there's ways to contest, but if we concede ground and let the other side determine and decide how we build a strong economy, which is, if you study tax policy, like I'm a big nerd, how we got to the place where in the 1980s the Democrats totally left tax policy and how it got dictated, and how we spent the last 40 years not talking about taxing the rich their fair share and letting Republicans and the Reagan administration control that, is because we refused to actually stand up for what we believe in. And so I think that is fundamentally what we have to do, is shift the narrative, own that we are the ones that have a vision for a just economy, and not concede any ground on that.
Yeah. Well done. I totally agree, and I think that this concept of people trust the Republicans more on the economy, and so we should just throw up our hands and not talk about it, is a huge issue. And all of the research that we've been doing at Winning Jobs for the last 2 years shows that we can move people when we actually address the issues that they want to talk about up front on the economy. I think the work that Somos did last year is on the doors. We could not get away from it. Roshni, when you're talking about inflation and the rising cost of living or rising costs in general, I would say 90% of the conversations we were having at the doors were around that. And so we found that addressing people's economic anxiety up front is real, because people are going through this. And I actually don't see that as separate from conversations we're having with young voters. We tend to talk about young voters and working families. A lot of young voters are part of working families, right? Either leading them or part of them. And so these things are all tied up together. And I think it is, again, just pushing the needle on how are we talking, what are we talking about here? This is not, you're not just slashing services, you're slashing investments in working people, you're slashing investments in working family. That's bad for all of us. And so just, again, reframing and pushing us to reframe, when we're talking about investments, Republicans understand what an investment is. They do it all the time, but God forbid we invest in people. And so just moving that needle in that window of how we're talking about it, I think, in our everyday lives will help empower people to do that. And I think we have to do that. It is really important that people are not left in a place of we just can't change this. That helplessness feeling leaves people disengaged. It's why people don't turn out to vote. If we can move, especially young people, to think about, this concept that the government can and should work for us, that's an incredibly empowering narrative frame. And if we're giving them the tools to be able to do that, like Alexandra, you said, they're there, they're ready. They just, we're along for this ride with them, and we have to be able to give them the tools that they need to be able to make their voices heard too.
Yeah, I really want to emphasize, in the absence of us framing the issue, a lot of young people make up some pretty crazy things about what it is that we stand for. We've been doing focus groups with young people who are ostensibly on our side in all issues, on all progressive issues, but who either don't vote or vote for Republicans. And when we ask them, when we dig in, when we ask why, they say, yeah, Republicans are the party that is only looking out for wealthy white people, but Democrats aren't any better. And that is because we haven't been reaching out to them and talking to them about what it is that we're actually doing to make their lives better. And it's not enough, to be clear. What we've been doing is not enough. But we haven't been talking about what we actually are doing and how we're different. So I'll give another example too. When the Inflation Reduction Act passed, we were in similar focus groups with young voters, and we were talking about the actual policies that passed that would impact their lives. So we were talking about the historic investments in clean energy, lowering healthcare costs. We were talking about some of the reforms that the Biden administration was making to make the tax code fairer. And the response was just overwhelmingly, why haven't we heard about any of this? And so we're just not reaching them with this economic message. And in the absence of that, we're allowing Republicans to define how we talk about the economy with young voters.
And I'll just add quickly, I think it's important to remind leaders that already young people have run for office. They're running campaigns, they're building power, whether or not we like it or not. And I think also to remember what happens in the minority sets us up for what's possible in the majority. And the status quo, especially around the economy, and when we go back, is not going to be good enough. We have to create an economy and a democracy that works for all people, and that means going far, far beyond. And like you've been saying, the right pulls the debate so much farther. So I think remembering that once we get back in the majority, it's not just going back to the status quo, it's going to propose solutions that match the scale, scope, and urgency of the crisis that we're facing, and letting young people lead the way.
I want to ask one more question. Open it up to your, yes, please. Open it up to your question. Roshni, you make the point that part of the problem is that young voters simply aren't hearing progressive messengers, elected messengers, many of us in this room. And so I want to ask all of you to kind of look ahead into the fall and beyond as we enter the political system, season, I should say, even further, as we talk about taxes and appropriations. What are some really practical tips you would give progressives, folks in this room, folks who are watching, about how we can talk about these issues so that we actually meet young people where they are?
I think the biggest tip that I would give is not to talk about it in a theoretical way when you're talking about the economy, especially because the immediate thing that young people specifically are thinking about is day-to-day costs and how they're going to survive day to day. When we're talking about the policies that we're enacting or policies that we're pursuing, it's really important to talk to them about how these policies will impact their lives, will impact their families, and will make things more affordable or accessible for them in a way that they can connect with and understand, rather than just talking about it at a very theoretical level. I feel like a lot of times our economic messaging is very high level, and so young voters really feel that it doesn't apply to them because they really don't feel like they're a part of this economy. We've never been really active participants in this economy the way that it has been defined through the 90s and early 2000s. And so reframing that and making us active participants in the economy and what that means for us and for our day-to-day would be really important.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. As you were talking, I was thinking about just my own personal, I've had to make that choice. Do I pursue higher education, basically take on a mortgage, or do I, make the choice of protecting my family, or making enough money to help my family? And so, I think what is really, really important for us is right now looking at the leadership of who's at the top of the party and how it's not as reflective of the base of the party, or folks that look like Delia or like us on stage. And so I think it's not just electing people to office, but I do think that when we build real power at all levels of government and truly invest in the base of people that power those victories, we're going to see even more results. This is the most diverse, youngest Congress, despite it still being pretty old in our nation's history, and that is absolutely because of the power of young people that were leading the charge on these campaigns, that we're running for office. And so I think really just not taking young people for granted and sharing their stories is critical.
Yes, I think, I don't know what everybody's job is in this room, but I think all of us probably have jobs where we touch the economy and talk to people about the economy, because we can sit up here and be like, this is what candidates should do, right, and the party should do, but ultimately that's up to them. But what power do you all have as individuals in this room with your current jobs, and what is the frame and reference and how you all talk about the economy? So I've spent 20 years working on economic justice. I spent 10 years organizing immigrant workers, years at UAW, years at SEIU. Then I ran for office, and I live in Texas. And I always say, like, my greatest gift to the progressive organizations that I work with is that I've spent 20-something years living in Texas, and I love it because there is no lefty choir to preach to. There are only non-believers to convert. And I think sometimes in this room, right, like, we can get into our silos, especially with social media, especially when we talk about young people, and think that if you get a lot of likes or something like that, you're actually having a winning message. And we think that if everyone's talking like us, then we're actually winning, when actually that means your circle isn't big enough. And so one, I want us to challenge is like, easy, simple language is the most important thing. Stories are the most important thing. Like, I love talking to people that aren't as political as me or aren't as progressive as me, because guess what? There aren't enough activists and organizers to change the world and win elections. They're just not. And so we have to meet people where they're at and talk about their lived reality. I always say there's also something else that we do as progressives, is we stay in the pain and the disempowerment of what we're up against versus like the power we have. And so every time we do messaging, we try and do three things. One, honor people's pain of what they're living every day already. Two, take them to a progressive vision of what could be different, a positive vision of how their life could be different. And three, the power they have to make it happen. And I think that is when we do that as progressives. Look, the conservatives have an easier time because they're painting a picture to take us backwards. We're trying to paint a picture of the future, and that's always harder to do. So don't get fucking lazy and not paint that picture of the future. Paint that picture of the future.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. I think the one thing that I want to highlight about what you were saying about an empowering message and not leaning into a disempowerment is, like, you can acknowledge people's economic anxiety, but then continue to take them along with you on this narrative messaging road, right? So I think the one huge thing that I'm always like, if you get one thing away from what I'm saying, please do this. It is that to make sure that we're actually centering people, centering working people, centering the people that we're trying to reach and that we're talking to as the heroes of our economic message, as the subject of our economic message. I think people are very open to government having a role, but so often in the way that we frame things, government has the starring role. Government has the savior role, right? And like, that is incredibly disempowering for people. And I'll give just a concrete example that came out in our research that was sort of my light bulb moment of why this is so important. When we rolled out the child tax credit, amazing, one of the biggest anti-poverty programs of our time, so incredibly important. It did all of this amazing, incredible things, but the way that we messaged it was that the child tax credit was gonna lift half of children out of poverty, that the child tax credit would specifically lift 40% of Latino children out of poverty. Like, I can still see that printed in black and white in the talking points. When we frame our economic policies this way, we're framing the government as the savior. We, the government, this child tax credit, we with this child tax credit are coming in to save you poor people. And that's an incredibly disempowering message to leave people with. We flipped that script and said the child tax credit would give working families the tools that they needed so that they could take care of their family, so that they could build a good life for their family. When you do that, you center people as the hero. We are the ones who are doing this. Americans are like, we are bringing us back from this pandemic. And so just would encourage us to think about that as we're framing our issues.
That's an excellent point, and I couldn't help but think that the right really frames it in these very terms that you use, right? That these government policies will empower business. That's an excellent point. Well, let's open it up to questions, and would love to have a conversation with this really incredible panel. We have a hand over here. I think a mic is going to come to you in a second.
Hi, I'm Callahan. I don't know if I should introduce myself or not, but anyway, Melissa, just based on what you were just saying, I was thinking about talking about framing it so that people are centered. How do you frame it in that way while also going back to the point that was brought up earlier about ensuring that young people especially understand that Democrats or progressives are the ones helping them without, centering it so that it seems like government is the savior?
Yeah, so we went through a large process of trial and error last year and how we were doing this at the doors, and I do think we learned a lot about how we can do it. So the first step for us was in our scripts, and not only our door-to-door scripts, but also our paid ad scripts, was acknowledging what people were going through up front, right? Acknowledging that people's economic anxiety, economic pain was real. Asking them, what is the biggest thing that they could think of that would change? And it always came back to some sort of economic tie, right? What would be the most life-changing for them to happen? And then pivoting that to solutions. People right now are when people are existing in the day-to-day, they're very solutions-oriented. And rather than use the word help, we found providing tools and opportunity for you to build a good life for yourself and your family, to be the good frame to then talk about actual progressive policies like affordable healthcare, like affordable childcare, like student loan relief, like loan debt relief, all of these things we framed as tools and opportunity for you to build a good life for yourself, your community, and your family. And so really leaning into tools and opportunities as opposed to help was the way that we found to best do that.
Thank you.
I would just add to that too really quickly. Another layer on top of it is acknowledging the work that people put in to vote. Because you went out and voted, we were able to pass these policies that now you can use to empower and build up your family. So that is another really important layer that allows it to connect back to voting and who you're voting for.
Very excited about this empowerment messaging we're hearing. I think there's a hand over there. Yes.
Hey everyone, hi friends, it's good to see you. Thanks for this great panel. You touched on this a little bit earlier and in some of your polling that I'm really excited to see. But young people, we're talking about consolidated wealth, consolidated power in our economy and how corrosive that is in every single way. I think young people also understand better than any other generation based on polling and all the evidence, you guys have beautifully laid out today, that there's also consolidated wealth and power in our party and in the Democratic Party. And I'm wondering how, and obviously Alexandra touched on this already, but I'm wondering, how do we confront the role of corporate power and this kind of consolidation in our own party and really realign, use young people and the passion that young people are already bringing to help realign the party around this kind of economic vision that so many people are putting forth today?
Yeah, I can grab that. I think, and folks, yeah. I don't need to keep repeating the same point, but I think that we're on our way to building real political power for young people up and down the ballot, but especially critical at the federal level, as you know. I think last cycle, there was just one super PAC that spent $22.5 million across 9 different races. And so it's not just a progressive problem when it comes to corporate power or corporations getting into our, it's a Democratic Party, it's a democracy problem. So I would say that continuing to invest in this next generation of leadership that truly understands who we are up against and what we must do is going to be really critical. And I think continuing to build on the outside is already happening with groups like yours and so many young people helping elect more folks to office. So I think that's especially important at the federal level, but anyone else?
I think the other thing I would add there is that we often get boxed into this message frame of talking about redistribution only, right? Redistributing the pie, when we should be talking about 2 things: redistributing and making the wealthy actually pay their fair share, and investing in people so that we're actually growing the economy, right? And that opens us up to helping people think in a non-zero sum way when we're talking about both redistribution and growth. but growth by investment in people. And so I think like that is very important in the conversations that we're having, because it also helps mitigate the attacks that, the attacks that others can have on us. I know we're not supposed to be partisan up here.
And we're not. But do you have a sense, I guess, let me just follow up, of who do you think is doing a good job in framing the message around empowerment, around how government can help you and your family succeed? Are there messengers we should be looking at who are doing a good job with this?
We've heard pretty consistently in a lot of our focus groups when we ask young people who they're seeing, who's representing them, they frequently bring up people like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, and the reason that they bring her up is because of the way that she breaks down different pieces of legislation via social media or any of her platforms, explains it to young people and explains the impacts that it has on them and on their communities. They cite her very frequently, no matter where they're from, and so I think that type of messaging example of, again, like I was saying, make it very simple and show them how it applies to them, has really resonated. And they also, the type of messengers they want to see, they refer to as fighters. They want to know that there are people in government who are fighting for them the same way that they feel they are going out every election year to fight for our democracy. They want that same energy back. And so showcasing fighters as messengers is also important.
I would say our polling similarly shows, but the number one in our polling candidate, elected official that comes up every time is Bernie Sanders for young people, which he's not the youngest guy if you didn't know, but it's because of progressive policy, and that's ultimately what we tell people, especially because there is an election around the corner where there will be likely two older folks running, is like ultimately what young people really care about is progressive policy and someone that's going to fight for them, and not in trying to represent ordinary people, again, in the most simple language possible. That is consistently what we see over and over again from young people. And, sorry, against college versus non-college, because the other thing is college versus non-college. We have to remember the majority of young people, we think about them as college students, but the most common age for an African American and Latina to have their first child is age 25. So we are actually talking about like a lot of young working class families and need to keep that in mind. And the majority of Americans over age 25 have no college degree. We are talking again about majority non-college.
Hi everyone, I know them. I'm Jenny with a G, nice to meet you all. My question for you all is, we are talking about what is young in this conversation, and what are, because I'm young, but according to some groups, I'm no longer allowed in them, so I just want to know what that definition is, and then also what are interventions that are happening for pre-voters, because young people, that when I think of young, they are children, they are under 18, they are very much not engaged as other people were. So what interventions or programs are happening to meet them at their level, so as they do get to voting age, they know what they're looking for and what they want to talk about?
Careful, please, in terms of how you define young. Some of us are very sensitive to that answer.
At NextGen, we define young 18 to 35, but I will say when I said there's a political revolution happening, also if you're an older millennial, which I am, I'm still young at heart, the most common two myths about young people have been disrupted. One is that young people don't vote, they're civically disengaged. We actually have the highest youth voter turnout the last 3 elections across the country. The other big thing that has long held true and has been disrupted by older millennials is that as you get older, you become less progressive and you become more conservative. Older millennials in the United States and in Western Europe are staying just as progressive, especially on things like race and the economy, because guess what they've inherited. So there are some people that even go up to 40. We only classify 18 to 35.
Big support for that in the room, yes.
But we classify 18 to 35, and there are some big differences between like Gen Z and millennials, and so we segment based on like people's life experience too when we message, because those are important indicators as well, but that's generally for us.
I will just say I like the 18 to 35 because it means I'm still young. But I think technically I've aged out of the U.S. Census Bureau's idea of young, so.
You're obviously going to be young to me.
But the other thing I would just say is, yes, like all of the things that you said, but also when we're talking about investments in people, and I keep coming back to this because it's so important, is like there's a huge opportunity right now to start thinking about like the trickle-down policies of the 80s and like that sort of economic theory that was put out there. Like we heard it a lot as kids. It sort of like continues to live in the back of our heads. There's a huge opportunity right now where there is, for the first time in my life, a real conversation happening nationally about middle out and what it means to invest from the bottom up and actually investing in people. And so I think young people will very much respond to that. And if we continue to put that narrative out there, it is the economic theory that will be in the back of their heads throughout their lives in the way that for older millennials, it has been this like trickle down theory that obviously didn't work. The other thing I would say is like, we have to actually put our money where our fucking mouths are on this and like invest in young people and programs targeted to young people. And want to just echo, like, they are not disengaged. We had in Arizona last month a day where we took high school seniors to the Arizona State Capitol. Like, it is important that we give people a view and access to their government, and that's how we get them engaged. We had 200 high school seniors sign up for this, and like, partially, I'm sure they wanted a day off school, and like that helped, but they actually like showed up and asked really important questions and were incredibly engaged. And so I think when they have the opportunity to engage, they do, but we have to actually invest in those programs.
Hi, I'm Garrett from Maine, via the Deep South originally. I'm perplexed by one economic question or issue that we come into contact with around young people, which is the phenomenon of people sort of saying it's not worth going to college. You know, rational agents look around, they say, hey, look, I don't go to college. I can actually go to a 2-year degree or program and come out earning more than I'm going to earn 10 years after going to college. So I'm just curious if coming back to what are the solutions and how people relate to them, given that reality that college for many people who are under-resourced to begin with is a pathway to greater economic uncertainty, when on the flip side we acknowledge that that is an important public good for people to have access to, and ideally it's universally accessible and free, but we're not there yet. So how do you navigate that tension in your interactions with young people and thinking about government's role as, in that process?
So obviously there's a student debt crisis, if you hadn't heard. But I think that when, you know, you talk about, I think we have to honor like that there is a student debt crisis, and college is, for some people, feels like out of reach, right? Even though long-term the data shows like it will increase economic, personal well-being. But I think the investment in people that Melissa is talking about is so important. Like, there used to be a time in this country, you know, we were very much pioneers of the public education movement globally. And it was when we started to offer free, tuition-free public education K through 12, some people in this country thought that was a crazy idea, that we were going to invest in people to build our economy, and it actually turned out to be the greatest force to build the economic well-being in this country. But today, what a college degree is what a high school diploma was back then. And so we haven't expanded our public education system to match what our economic needs are, right? 60% of new jobs in this country at least require a bachelor's degree, and yet roughly 60% over the age of 25 don't have a college degree. Like, it doesn't match up. And so I think when we talk about it not as just like giveaways, but it's like it's investments. How do we build a strong economy in this country? What are we judging it by? What are the pillars of a progressive economic agenda? For me, it's strong tax policy that tax the rich and corporations their fair share. It's strong worker power and labor movements. It's reining in and regulating corporate power for people in the environment. And it's investments in our greatest assets, which are the American people. So like shifting from giving, we're not giving things away, it's an investment in building our strong economy. So I think it's good to not just tell people they should go to college, but yes, we don't have what we need, but we need to get there. Again, let's paint the vision of where we should be, I think.
I want to make one more call for questions. Yes. Right over there. And then I have a question that will hopefully leave us on a very positive note, so stay tuned for that.
Hey, howdy, my name's Sydney. I'm with Working America, which is the community affiliate of the AFL-CIO, which means we organize people without the benefit of a union on the job, which is most of us. So a lot of work to be done there. But we've found, because we're a part of the labor movement, talking about the economy and talking about it all the time is incredibly effective. People want to talk about the fact that their rent is skyrocketing while their wages are stagnating. They want to talk about the fact that they haven't been able to go to the doctor in years because they're afraid of what the bill is going to look like after they're done with their checkup, right? And so our polling and our data and our pretty rigorous A/B testing have found talking about the economy is really impactful across the board, across demographics, right? Across age groups. And so I guess my question is, how do we, as like a movement of like labor affiliates, of people who are working towards economic justice, et cetera, like how do we sort of push past the narrative of like Democrats aren't good in the economy, Democrats don't care about the economy? Because we found that when we talk to people about these issues, they're voting a particular way, right? They're voting for Democrats. They're voting and mobilizing more effectively. And so I feel like we have the formula. I just, I'm curious what your thoughts are about how do we sort of get everyone on the same page and start pushing that formula and mobilizing people effectively.
I think it's a little bit of what we've all been talking about is reframing the narrative. I think when people say Democrats aren't good on the economy, what they mean is in job creation, in tax policy, and not necessarily all of the really important things that you were talking about, which is why it's really crucial to reframe the way that we're talking about the economy and not let Republicans continue to dominate economic conversations, but reframe it so the economy is health justice, it's climate justice, it's racial justice, and let's make the economy about those things so that when we start talking about who's better on the economy, we think about climate justice, racial justice, and then the conversation can flow from there.
Yeah, the only other thing that I would add to that is like, it is so, I think in all of our testing too, we have found the same thing. Like, it is so effective to just talk about the economy, and it's because part of what's happening in voters' minds right now and in people's minds is that they simply don't think that Democrats have any sort of theory or plan. And while they don't agree with the other side's plan, at least there's a plan there. And so the more that we can push out, which is why I am so excited to see the middle out, the bottom up and the middle out messaging, because that's an economic theory, right? Middle out is an economic theory. And Democrats haven't pushed an economic theory or an economic solution in so long. Like, this is an opportunity for us to capitalize and continue to talk about that. And I think at least having a centralized theory out there will make it easier for us to all be on the same page about what we're saying about the economy and our plan for it.
Very quickly, and Roshni, I want to start with you. One of the kind of more difficult numbers that we've seen in polling, even in the polling we've done together, is that young people are very frustrated at the direction our country's moving in, right? And part of it maybe is they don't see enough fighters, and this debt ceiling, debate we just had maybe showed us some of that. So, just quickly, how would you convince them otherwise? What would you say to somebody, a young person who's kind of really, lost some hope about their future?
That's a great question, and I would actually point back a few years and think about the summer of 2020 when we were going through a terrible pandemic and George Floyd had just been murdered, and we saw the country, especially young people, a multi-generational, multiracial coalition come together to demand change. And what that change has brought to this country over the last 3 years has been historic. And obviously there's more work to do, but young people were driving that level of change. And that was a point in time when, honestly, if you were polling right at that moment, young people felt hopeful about the direction of the country and about how they could affect the direction of the country. And so more of that fighter attitude, more of empowering young people to take this action and take control of what the government is doing, and voting for people who are going to take that action and further their policies and their agendas, I think can help increase that sense of that we're going in the right direction.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, you know, it's very understandable why young people would feel hopeless, why there is an erosion of trust, because you have seen pretty much whether it's abortion, climate, you name it, the adults in the room sort of stand by. But I've also seen, as you've pointed out over the past several years, how young people have been at the forefront in these elections, making change. They've been at the forefront of running organizations, running campaigns, and it might be hard to see right now, but it has been building slowly, especially past over the 5 years, and obviously we stand on the shoulders of giants before us. But right now, I think as much as it's easy to be fearful and unhopeful, having the courage to stand up and be hopeful in the spite of all of it is huge.
So my organization's been around 10 years. So we have 10 years of like tracking what are the ways to fight back against cynicism, hopelessness, how to get people engaged. And over those 10 years, it really hasn't changed, even before Trump, post-Trump. It is about talking about the power that the largest, most diverse and progressive generation has to win when they come together and vote and exercise their power. And so just using that you fight cynicism and hopelessness with hope and power, right? And so saying, yes, the arc of history is long and it bends towards justice, but we're gonna bend it with the full power and weight of 70 million young people across this country that have the power to turn our country in a totally different direction from the people that are trying to take us backwards. We're moving forward with our vision, our power, and together they can't stop us.
Yeah, I don't hate to follow that. I think just, Alexandra, going back to something that you were saying earlier is like, and Roshni, I think you both touched on that, but it's like highlighting the ways that they have already used their power. Like this, you know, like the wins that we have had policy-wise over the last couple of years are only because young people helped us win key elections, right? Like they were able to swing those elections using the power of their vote. And then that this is like helping them see that they can do that wherever they are, you know, with what they already have. Thinking about the George Floyd protests that happened in the summer of 2020, you know, I grew up in a very small, rural, conservative Kansas town, this farm town, and back home, it was like, I was brought to tears by these pictures of this group of young people that had still managed to hold a protest in that small, tiny Kansas farm town, and like they came together as a multiracial coalition to do that. And so just, you know, highlighting that young people have already done that and we have the power to do it now.
Thank you all so very much. Please give it up to this incredible panel.
We will now be taking a brief intermission. Programming will resume in 10 minutes.